Any of y'all Lego people? Anyone like love Legos? Anyone, just like a huge Lego guy? All right, got one. There's a bunch over here. All right, yeah, let's go. My son has his hand raised. There you go. That's good. Um, yeah, Legos. I don't know if y'all have like seen like you go to Target or Walmart or whatever store you go to, you see like the Lego sets. Those are neat. Those are neat. And then I don't know if you are aware of this. If you're not Lego people, you're probably not aware of this. That there's a next level of Legos, like an architecture type Lego, where it's not just like 400 pieces or 1,000 pieces, but it's thousands of pieces for you to put together this particular, whatever Lego thing you're building. It's the architecture Lego series. And it's just thousands and thousands of pieces. And they've got incredible things that you can build with Legos. If you're a Star Wars fan, honestly, the Star Wars stuff is probably some of the most popular stuff that Lego does. And I'm not a Star Wars fan. Not because it's not good, just because I never watched it. I watched one episode, and it was the first new one after all the old ones were released. The first new one came out, and my friend was like, hey, you should go and start watching this. I had never seen any of them before. So we went to the theater. Everyone was dressed up. That was entertaining. But then the movie itself wasn't good. I don't know if that just offends you, but the very first one, first one of the new ones that came out, I just wasn't a fan. So I fell asleep halfway. It was the midnight premiere. I fell asleep about halfway through, and I was like, this is awful. Why, you've been waiting 30 years for this? Like, well, goodness gracious. I don't know. Anyway, that's beside the point. Nevertheless, Lego has these so I don't know what they're called, but they've got this really big, huge circle sphere thing with like a dent punched in the middle of the side of it. Like they got one of those you can build. They've got this really long spaceship that flies through the air. You can build those. They've got these elephant-looking things that are kind of shorter and skinnier than elephants, like skinny elephants, right, that are walking. They're not elephants. They're like machines. Y'all know what I'm talking about. You're seeing them in my head. You know what I'm talking about. They've got these incredible. My favorite, they don't have the same one anymore because I looked this up this week. They've got a White House version of Lego, like you can build the White House. Now they got a smaller version. It's kind of dinky, but they have this big, huge version of White House, right? So Emerson loves Legos. He just happens to be sitting in here. Hey, buddy, all the way in the back here. Everybody, you want to wave? E? There you go. So he loves Legos. He's really good at putting Legos together. And in fact, so when he was younger, we would buy him these sets, and he would put them together, and like they would be flawless. And I'm like, man, this is incredible. Like he'd read the instructions, he'd piece them all together. It would take no time. And so we're like getting his village pieces, and we're putting them all together. Like, man, this is good. This is like a little Harry Potter village. There's a castle, and so we're adding it together. And in my mind, it's like, man, this is so cool. And so I'd walk in his room, all right? He'd have him down playing with someone else, and I'd walk in. I'm like, hey, this is not what it looked like yesterday. Like yesterday we finished this incredible masterpiece where we followed the directions to the T, and it looked exactly like it's supposed to. And today it looks nothing like it's supposed to. Like, what happened? And he's like, well, I made my own thing. Why would you do that? Why would you do that? We bought the set so that it could look like the set. He's like, yeah, but I got this really cool car that I made out of the house, and I made this car that flies, and it's got a rocket ship, and it's like a limousine also, and it's also got cannons on it. And it's like, yeah, but it was supposed to be like Hagrid's house, right? You know what I'm saying? Now it's like this car. Where did you get the mud tires from? You know what I'm saying? It's four-wheeling back and forth, right? You know what I'm talking about? That's not how I work. Like, I want to put it together. If I were to put together the Lego White House, I would put it together, and I would want to sit it on a shelf. And when someone walks in, I would want them to say, man, that's really cool. That's what I want to happen. I don't want anyone to walk in and say, man, we could make something really cool out of that. No, I want them to see the finished product, right? That's just me. I don't know if y'all build things. I don't know if you're Lego people building things like that. There's this one guy who gets kind of in a mess to build something. And he's not a builder. In fact, he'd never built anything before in his life. And yet he finds himself building something fairly substantial, to be honest with you. And very much so, didn't have a set of plans that came with directions. He just finds himself building. To kind of give you a little background before we get to this building moment, we're in a section of the Bible referred to as the Old Testament. There's really two big pieces of the Bible. Old Testament talks about the story of how we get to Jesus, and it talks about the establishment of the people of God and the Jewish nation, and how Jesus gets to us from that particular people, and how God kind of builds up the case for the need for Jesus even. And that's what we have throughout the Old Testament. And then we have the New Testament, which kind of says, hey, this is Jesus, and this is what happens because Jesus shows up. So this particular moment in the history of the people of God takes place in the Old Testament. Right in the place where there's some issues that are happening. So to kind of give you a little bit of a summary, anytime you open the Old Testament, and you open it and you kind of take a look at it, almost always you're going to find yourself in the midst of a cycle. And the people of God just go around and around this very same cycle over and over and over again. And so it starts with sin, right? So they do something nationally as the people. Not each one of them had their own issues, right? Sinning individually, but nationally they would begin to move in a direction because at that particular time God was interested in the nation of the people of God. And so he said, hey, I want you as a people to move in this direction, to obey these particular commands, those kind of things. And they wouldn't do that. And so sin would happen from a national standpoint. And then from the sin, the way that God punished them is he would allow someone to take them over. And so we go from sin to servitude. And so all of a sudden they were enslaved. And sometimes they were exiled. Other people would come in. And so we go sin and there's a consequence. And so now God's going to allow someone to come in and do something with them or take them over. So you've got the servitude. And from there, sometimes that would last for 400 years, or sometimes it lasts for just a generation or two. And it just depended on how long it took for the third piece, the third cog in the wheel to happen. So you had sin and servitude, and then it was always followed by the supplication, this I'm sorry moment of so sorry. We should not have done the thing at the top of the wheel. We shouldn't have gotten involved in those things, which led to us being in servants or enslaved or a service to these people or occupied by these people. We shouldn't have done that. And so we say, sorry, God. And then from that, salvation comes. And then when salvation comes, that's when everything is good and all the things are working. And before you know it, sin happens again and the wheel starts over. And so anytime you open the Old Testament, except for right at the very, very beginning, anytime past like the first few chapters of Genesis, you open it, they're in one of those places. Sin, servitude, supplication, salvation. And it's just a cycle over and over and over and over again. And at this particular moment, we, with the people of God, are in the place where servitude is happening, yet the supplication piece hasn't quite happening, and the servitude is kind of coming to an end, and that's where we're in the middle of that cycle. So salvation seems to be a long ways off, farther than they could ever imagine, and that's kind of where they're at. At this point in time, there's a kingdom called Babylon that came and had overtaken the Jewish people, the Jewish nation, and they had caused an exile to happen. And so they took the best and the brightest and the workers, and they took them to Babylon, and they put them to work, and they made sure that it strengthened the nation of Babylon. And eventually, Babylon was overtaken by the Persian Empire. And so you had the Jewish people who a bunch of them had to be exiled to Babylon, and then the Babylon was thriving, and the Persians came in and said, hey, we're going to pop you in the mouth, Babylon. So Babylon is gone. Persia's now in charge. And they tell the Jewish people, we don't know why you're here. You can go back if you want to. Like, you don't have to stay here. Like, we're not, you're welcome to, or you can stay if you want to. It is what it is. You can go back. But most people didn't want to go back because Jerusalem was torn to pieces. I mean, the walls were destroyed. The temple was destroyed. I mean, their entire way of life was gone. There was no economy that was happening. It was just a war-torn nation. There was nothing left. And so some people were like, yeah, let's go back and rebuild it because that's our home. And then other people were just like, it's not worth the inconvenience. Like, in my lifetime, I'm not going to be, they just stayed. And so we fast forward a good little bit. And during that time, we have the lady we talked about a couple weeks ago, Esther. Esther becomes queen to one of these Persian kings, and that was an incredible story. You can go read that if you need to get caught up. About 35 or so years after Esther is, instated as queen, we fast forward. Esther is now gone. There's still another Persian king. His name is Artaxerxes. And Artaxerxes is still doing the same thing. If Jews want to go back to their country, they're welcome to do it. Go do your thing. Right? But if you want to stay, you're welcome to stay. But I'm the king and we're doing these things. There's no God involved. There's no Yahweh. There's no Jehovah. It's just whatever the king wants, right? And that's the kind of the setting that we're in. And there's a guy that's living in this kingdom. His name is Nehemiah. Nehemiah is a Jew. If you go back throughout the history, his people were from Jerusalem. So he's a Jew, and his family has stayed rooted there in this particular city. And so he's in the city. He's hanging out. And his brother comes to visit him. And his brother shows up, and his brother lives back in his homeland, back in Judah, back in Jerusalem. And he shows up, and so they're having a conversation, right? So some of you probably saw relatives from out of town this past week. And, you talk about things, how are the family? That's the kind of conversation that's happening, that's going on. And so Nehemiah asks his brother, he says, hey, tell me about Jerusalem. How are the people that went back from exile, right? This has been about 96 to 100 years or so. after exile, after they were allowed to go back. So it's been a couple of generations. He says, tell me what's going on. And his brother looks at him and says, hey, it's actually not great. It's not great. In fact, this is what he says in Nehemiah 1:3. They said to me, those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire. So I don't know if Nehemiah was anticipating this type of answer, or if it was just like let's just catch up. Tell me about Jerusalem. How are the people in Jerusalem? I don't know. It doesn't give us a great indication on how sincere the ask was, but sure enough, he asks, and sure enough, the answer is very sincere. He's like, bro, this is not good. There's disgrace. There's no walls around Jerusalem. There's a lot of trouble that's happening. The gates have been burned with fire. And Nehemiah hears this, and it tells us that his heart begins to break. He's like, oh, this is not good. This is awful. Now, I don't know why Nehemiah is all of a sudden concerned, because Nehemiah had to have known this. I mean, no news had come from Jerusalem in the last 100 years that said, hey, they're rebuilding, right? There was none of that. None of that was happening. And so surely he knew that things weren't on the up and coming for Jerusalem. And so as he's processing this, I don't know if it was just because now his brother who is back there is now telling him. I'm not sure what's going on in his mind, but for some reason, what his brother tells him concerns him. He's like, man, this is awful. This is no good. And his heart begins to break. It's almost like he's concerned with what God is concerned with. It's almost like he knows that God would be upset with this, and so he's going to be concerned with it. So we want to kind of look at his reaction, which I think is pretty important. And it just so happens that the Bible gives us really specific details about how he responds to this news. Nehemiah 1:4 says this, when I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. That's intense. So it's one thing for me to kind of hear some bad news and I hate that for them. Oh man, that tears me up. What a shame. I didn't see that one coming, did you? Yeah, no, yeah. So what do you think the chances of Bama getting in the playoff are? 0? Of course. Yeah. Right, and then we just move on. We hear bad news, and it's like, okay, well let's move on. I'm concerned. My heart hurts, but at the same time, it's like I'm not going to dwell on it. But for Nehemiah, he hears it, and it says, for some days he mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. For days. So he hears this, that the city is broken down, there's disgrace and trouble for the people, and it wrecks him. And for days he fasts and prays and mourns for days. Wow. He has a prayer that after he had done this for some days, he then has this prayer that we have recorded that he writes down. And I'm not going to get into the whole prayer, but it ends with his request. It's like, hey, I want favor in front of this guy. He's talking about the king, right? He wants favor in front of the Persian king. That's what he's asking God for. I just want favor in front of him. He admits that his people has sinned, so the supplication of the cycle is starting. It's like, hey, I admit we've done wrong. I admit we haven't got it right. I admit this is awful. I admit these things. And what I'm asking God is that you would just give me some favor in front of this guy talking about the king. And then the quotes end, so the prayer ends, end quote. And then there's this line that he writes about himself, because he's writing this book about himself, talking about this situation he's in. And the next line says, I was cupbearer to the king. So now we get some insight. Okay. So Nehemiah is not just like some normal, everyday Jewish guy walking around still living in the Persian Empire because he doesn't want to go back. He's made something of himself. In fact, now he's a guy that sits and stands in the king's presence daily. He's around him all the time. The most powerful man in their little empire, it's actually a big empire, he hangs out with all the time. He's the guy that sips his wine, eats his grapes, tries the chicken before he hands the chicken off to make sure there's no poison in it, right? So there's a lot of trust. There's a ton of trust that's happening. In fact, if you look back in the family history of Artaxerxes, he actually had someone not too far away from him that was assassinated for the same thing from a really close, trusted advisor. And so Artaxerxes, when he's putting his team together, his inner circle together, he's very choosy about it because of his own family history. And Nehemiah has positioned himself inside of that inner circle. And so as he's praying and mourning and fasting, and he's like, oh man, here's what, and then his request is, just give me favor in the king's presence. Just give me favor with the guy. I'm the cupbearer to the king. Man, how about that? So we fast forward just a little bit. Nehemiah's doing his job, and he's going about it like, hey, we're day after day. And one day he's having a hard time. And evidently it's showing on his face. And so the king looks at him and says, hey, what's wrong with you today? I've never seen you like this before. I haven't seen you. Like, what's happening? Like, what's wrong? What's wrong? And Nehemiah responds. He's like, well, honestly, I'm struggling. How can I be happy? Because where I'm from in Jerusalem, the city walls they're destroyed and the gates are burned with fire. And so I'm upset. I'm upset. And so the king looks at him and says, well, what do you want? And he's like, hey, Nehemiah, what's the deal? Come on, spit it out. I never see you like this. And he's like, well, this is the deal. And so the king is like, okay, all right, cool. Well, we need to fix this. So what do you want? Like that's cool. I get it. So what do you want, though? Like, how do you want to fix this? You know, because you can't mope around here all. We're not doing like sad face all day. You know. So what do you want? This is the king said to me, what is it you want? Then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king. If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my ancestors are buried so that I can rebuild it. What? What? Nehemiah, you hold your pinky up on a gold goblet sipping wine all day. You take single bites out of people's chicken, and you're going to go rebuild the walls of Jerusalem? That's your idea? That's what you think? Are you kidding me? The king, so in my mind, it's like, okay, if you're going to give me what I want, hey, can you give me a general contractor? Can you give me a group of folks that can construct something, and will you send them to rebuild the wall? That's what I'm asking. Nehemiah doesn't ask that. He says, hey, if it makes you happy, will you send me to go rebuild Jerusalem? And the king responds, okay. But how long is it going to take? When are you going to come back? And that's what he's saying. He's like, hey, all right, you can go, but you need to come back, right? Him and the queen are sitting there having a conversation, like, when are you coming back? So he sets the time. Says, hey, here's the time. And the king says, all right, deal. Let's do it. And then Nehemiah is like, hold on, I'm feeling good here. I'm feeling good. And so then he says, hey, if it pleases the king a little bit more, could I get some letters? Some letters for safe passage, for good conduct from here to Jerusalem, because I don't want nobody messing with me. You know what I'm saying? I don't want nobody messing with me. So if you would just like write, I got your back he didn't actually say that, but he needs letters, right? He needs letters for safe passage to get from here to where he's going. And then on top of that, he says, hey, will you also give me a letter that allows me to go to the royal forest, because I'm going to need some wood. And I need some wood for the beams and for the gates that I'm going to rebuild. I need that wood. And I got to have a place to live, so I got to build a house. Can I get some wood for the house, like a place where I'm going to reside? Can I get some wood out of the royal forest, the royal park for that? And the king says, yes, absolutely. And then the king says, you know what? I'm actually going to send some guards with you. I'm going to give you a little cavalry. It's going to help usher you over there. And here he goes. He's ready to go. So he gets his supplies. He heads that way. He has the resources the king's provided. He's got the king's blessing. God helps provide that. So when he gets there, he starts to inspect the wall, and he realizes this is a mess. Someone has jacked this up. And it is still just lying in rubbles. There's no gates. It's all burned, and there's just rubble. Piles of rocks everywhere. Like no one has made any progress on this. And so he's trying to think. He's like, this is not good. So he's got to assemble a team. He's like, I need help. This ain't something I'm just going to be able to Lego this thing back together. He's like, I need some help. I got to do something about this. And so he starts to put together a team. Now, all of a sudden, it's like, now Nehemiah, you and I are tracking, right? So I get this. So you got some initiative, I'm with you. I can identify with that. You got a plan, I'm with you. I can identify that. Let's put a team together. I'm with you, Nehemiah. You and I are on the same page. Let's go. You and I, that's exactly what I would do. That's it. So let's look at the team. So chapter 3 of Nehemiah is his team. It's one of the most boring chapters in all the Bible. Well, Leviticus will actually give it as a run for its money, like the whole book. But for sure, it's a boring little chapter. It's just a bunch of names. That's it. The whole chapter is just a bunch of names. So there's nothing entertaining that's happening unless you realize that those bunch of names are the roster of the people that are helping build back the walls of Jerusalem. And then all of a sudden it becomes entertaining because it says things like this, that there's a high priest and a priest is going to help build this thing. Like a high priest. Put your robe on, get your shovel, let's go. You know what I'm saying? There's some sons, that's good. There's some daughters, that can be. There's some perfume makers. That's the team he put together. He's like, you know what? I got to rebuild some walls. You make really good perfume. What do you think about helping on this team, you know? Some district rulers, they hadn't done nothing ever. Countrymen, temple servants, goldsmiths, merchants, like people who are just selling stuff in a store. That's the team he puts together to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. I'm still looking for the GC. Like, come on. You got nobody. You got nobody. Ain't no Masons on list. This project's got so many difficulties. The project itself is just enormous. We look in chapter 4, verse 10, it says this. Meanwhile, the people in Judah said, the strength of the laborers is giving out, and there is so much rubble that we cannot rebuild the wall. No wonder, of course it's given out. The only thing some of these people have picked up are jars of perfume in their entire life. And now they're having to move huge rocks. Now, I know what it's like to feel like, so for those of you who were not here last summer, this room that we're sitting in, not this most recent past summer, like 2020, what year is it? 2021 summer. Summer 2021, this room did not look like this. So volunteers pulled out 164,000 pounds of debris from in here, like blocking stuff. And there were nights in July, we called them demo nights, and we did them all throughout the month of July. There were months in July when I would get ready to walk out of here at night, and I was like, this is the dumbest thing we've ever done. Like, I am so freaking exhausted. I cannot pick up another piece of broken concrete cinder block or whatever it is, plaster / asbestos. There was no asbestos. We got rid of it. You know what I'm saying? We didn't get rid of it. Somebody else got rid of it. It was gone before we got here, right? So, I just was gonna, and then all of a sudden we did get a skid steer in here for about a week and a half, 2 weeks. And, oh, man. That thing, it had a bucket on it. The bucket would pick stuff up. After it picked stuff up, it would move stuff to another place. It was unbelievable. It was the most incredible. So I can't imagine. I mean, that was just the space we're sitting in right now. So can you imagine the walls that go around an entire city? Already and having to move it. So you can rebuild a wall, you got to move the broken down pieces first. They weren't just stacking Legos on top of broken Legos. They had to move it to then get to the place where they can create a foundation, then build the wall back, right? And so people are like, God, we don't have enough labor for this. Not only did they have that issue, they had some external issues. There were some foreign nations and enemies outside of their team. There was a guy named Sanballat. He was the governor of Samaria, at the time, the political center of Judea. Not really like a neighboring type city. And sure enough, with Jerusalem being in the destruction that it was, they benefited and profited from it. And there's this moment in chapter 4 where he talks about Sanballat. It says, when Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became angry and was greatly incensed. He ridiculed the Jews. And in the presence of his associates and the army of Samaria, he said, what are those feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from those heaps of rubble, burned as they are? Tobiah the Ammonite, who was at his side, said, what are they building? Even a fox climbing up on it would break down their wall of stones. So I don't know if you pick up, he's mocking them, right? So the whole army is there of Samaria, and it's like, what are those Jews doing? Are they trying to build back their walls? What are they going to do? Are they going to start offering sacrifices again? Because the temple's gone, right? They're going to start offering sacrifices again? Or I bet they're going to finish in a day. They can finish in a day. The guy, Tobias, is right. He's like, man, those walls, if a fox were to walk on those walls, they'd come tumbling down. Back in the day, that must have been a big insult. You know what I'm saying? If a fox. You know, when I look at moments in anything we do in life, just to push pause in the story for a second, the truth is, anytime we do something that God wants us to do, there's always going to be haters. And so you can't say yes to God and then be upset when people are upset with you. It just kind of comes with the territory. Time back in. So his solution for this army that maybe was threatening them and he felt threatened by it was like, hey, you know what? We're going to cut our laborers in half. Like, hold on. But Nehemiah, did you not hear the first issue that you're having is there's not enough laborers. They're weary already. Like they already, so we're going to cut it in half. And then he put them on guard. Like, hey, you're going to stay on guard. And then he told people, hey, you're going to work with one hand and then keep your hand on your weapon the other half of the time. So like we're picking up stones and we got one hand and there's other people that also could be working, but they're making sure no one's attacking us. And so all of a sudden you go from this weary, and then now they've created another issue. And so it's like, man, how are you going to get this thing done? Like this is not efficient at all. This is not working, right? Not only did they have these normal problems of just this huge, enormous struggle of just the weight of the rubble, not only did they have the external issues of the other countries that were not happy about Jerusalem becoming a valid city again, there was also some internal issues on their own team. You see, when people got back to Jerusalem, when the exile started, there were still people that had some resources. Not everyone did. Most everyone hadn't have anything. But there were some people that still had some resources, some haves and then mostly have-nots. And so the folks that had something, they started lending money because people needed to rebuild a life. And so they started lending money to some folks, that their neighbors and the people they had grown up with and people that experienced. So they started lending money to some people to say, hey, we'll help you rebuild. But the problem is they were charging so much interest that it actually became almost impossible for the people to repay it. And so obviously what they did have is if they had family land, like they still had that family, there might not be anything on the family land, but they could use it as collateral. They could put it down and say, well, if I don't repay you, here's this land. Or they would even do like indentured servitude where, well, if we don't pay it back, then my son will come and work for you for 7 years. So, things like that. Those kind of things were happening. And so people couldn't pay it back. And so this enormous gap started happening between the people who had a lot and the people they were taking advantage of. And they were saying, hey, we're going to squeeze everything we can, not just out of the people around, but also the people in our own city. Now, the problem with this is, and what they couldn't see, is that if the people in Jerusalem continued to get weak, there were still no walls, there was still no city, and so there was nothing to stop Sanballat or any of these other nations from coming in and taking from the people who had. There was nothing to stop them. They could come and take all the things, all the interest they had charged, all those things. So they were shooting themselves in the foot. They were causing issues for their own selves by saying, hey, we're going to impede the growth of the people here, and that's going to actually put us at risk. They didn't see or understand any of that, much less just the moral implications of charging way too much interest to your own people that are supposed to be your family. Nehemiah calls them together, and he says this. He says, when I heard their outcry and these charges, I was very angry. I pondered them in my mind and then accused the nobles and officials. I told them, you're charging your own people interest? So I called together a large meeting to deal with them and said, as far as possible, we have bought back our fellow Jews who were sold to the Gentiles. Now you are selling your own people, only for them to be sold back to us. They kept quiet because they could find nothing to say. So I continued, what you are doing is not right. Shouldn't you walk in fear of our God to avoid the reproach of our Gentile enemies? He said, hey, guys, For 100 years, we've been trying to get our people back. And so now we're like doing it, and you're just reselling them to yourselves? Like, what are we doing? What are we doing? We're intentionally making families go into bankruptcy so that we can benefit? He said, look, we're in the middle of building something. This isn't a small investment in some Dogecoin or Bitcoin or something with some play money. No, you're ruining families. And you're knowingly doing it. You give them a loan and you know there's no chance they're going to pay it back. And so you're going to have their that's why you do it. If there's anything that I take away, it's his willingness to have hard conversations. And the truth is anytime you do something that God asks you to do, that God's a part of, hard conversations are necessary conversations. That's just part of it. So he's got these just enormity of the job issues. Like, this is just a huge undertaking. And then he's got these external issues from Samaria and neighboring cities. And he's got the internal issues of the people that are there. He's got the issues of just how do you manage all those things. And then we get to this place in chapter 6, verse 15 and 16. And this is the way it kind of wraps up. It says this. So the wall was completed on the 25th of Elul in 52 days. When our enemies heard about this, all the surrounding nations were afraid and lost their self-confidence because they realized that this work had been done with the help of our God. Did you hear that? I don't know if as I was setting it up and walking through the issues he was experiencing, which you really need to go back and read all of the details that we just kind of walked through with the story of Nehemiah. There's a ton in there. Right, but the enormity of the issues he just dealt with, and then we conclude it with, and he solved them all in 52 days. Not only did he deal with the internal issues, the external issues, and the enormity of the issue, he actually completes the project in 52 days. 52 days. So much so, the other nations surrounding them, they lost self-confidence and became afraid because they knew that there's no chance. I mean, he had perfume people picking up bricks and moving bricks, just perfume makers. Goldsmiths. They had a nice grill, but they didn't have muscle. Like, what's going on? You know what I'm saying? And so they realized, man, there's something special happening there. This isn't an ordinary rebuild. 52 days. You know, I've tried those Legos. We build something and something else gets built out of it. Undoubtedly, we threw away the directions. And so I've tried to put it back together. Zero chance I'm putting that thing back together in 52 days. And I've already seen what it's supposed to look like. Nehemiah had never been to the city of Jerusalem. Ever. He'd never been. He'd never seen it. His entire life spent in Persia. 52 days. So the question is, what's the key? And whatever the key is, that's our application for today. Because whatever the key is for Nehemiah, that's the key we need in our own life, right? Most of you, well, I would say probably all of you, are not going to go rebuild walls in Jerusalem, right? That's probably not on the docket. But the key to rebuilding the walls in Jerusalem, that's what we want to chase down. So was it that he figured out, or that God gave him the opportunity to have favor with the king? Because that's what started it all, right? Like, the king said, hey, yeah, go ahead, for sure. I'll give you the papers and everything. Was that the key? Or was the key that God actually gave him favor? Not that the king was persuaded, but that God said, hey, I'll give you favor with him. Yeah. Was the key that he had all the resources he needed? That he had this ability to go into the royal forest and grab some of those things? Was the key the team that he built? An incredible list of people who have no business building anything, but somehow they come together. And not only do they build it, they with intimidation, fight off the prospect of another army coming and stopping them by building stuff with one hand on their sword and one hand wrapped around a piece of rock. while the other half of the laborers stood guard, right? Was that the key? A team that's willing to do anything, that's willing to stretch their limits and to push themselves, was that the key? Was the key the ability to solve the internal conflict, the interpersonal relationships where people were taking advantage of one another? And he had a hard conversation. Was that the key? Was the key all of the above? Put them all together and it's like, man, this is one really great leadership talk. How about that? I think the key was something we already mentioned. I read it right at the beginning. I don't know if it stood out to you. I want to read it to you again, though. So to remind you, his brother comes in. His brother comes in and they're having a conversation. He says, tell me about Jerusalem. Tell me about the people. And he tells them. And then I think the key happens. Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 4. When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. And in verse 5, then I said. And that's where the prayer starts. His request. Right? When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and I fasted and I prayed before the God of heaven. Then I said. In other words, he was praying and fasting and mourning in front of God for days before he ever got to the request. So he does all those things for days. Then he says, here's my request. And what is his request? That I find favor with that guy, the king. That's his request. For days. Now, I get it, right? I get the process of feeling a need and saying, man, I got to do something about this, right? Remember just a few weeks ago, we started this series out by saying, hey, the most important day-to-day question about your life is this. Are you where God can use you? The most important day-to-day question about your life is, are you where God can use you? And Nehemiah is illustrating this because Nehemiah is nowhere near where God wants to use him in Jerusalem. He's nowhere close to it. He is miles and miles and miles and miles away. In fact, again, he's never even been to the city where God wants to use him. He's never even seen it. He has no clue. He doesn't know the extent of the destruction. He's probably heard some stories. That's it. There's no Instagram for him to check out, #Jerusalem rubble. There's none of that. So he is miles away from where God wants to use him. Yet he makes a decision. You know what? Am I in a place where God can use me? Most people in that situation would say, well, in this particular situation, I'm pretty much out of commission. I can't get off. I'm cupbearer to the king. So no, God's not going to use me here. But remember, we follow that question up with the answer to that question. Are you in a position where God can use you? The answer to that question is always yes. Every single day of the week. It doesn't matter what you've just finished doing. Let's just say that 10 seconds ago, you just made the worst decision you've made in 10 years. And that decision has been made. And there's nothing you can do to take that decision back. Even in that moment, you are in a place where God can use you. Even there. Even if people have watched you make the decision. If people sat there and were like, please don't do it. Please don't do that. Please don't say that. Please don't respond that way. Golly, God, even if your whole family's watching you. And then you go through the whole thing and the decision is now 6 steps behind you. Even in that moment, God can use you if you make yourself available. It's doable. So I get the idea. Nehemiah said, man, golly, I need to do something so God can use. I get that. Last week we said, hey, the principle we need to live by is this. If God is concerned, I'm concerned. If God is concerned, I'm concerned. And so now we begin to understand why Nehemiah is so heartbroken about the city of Jerusalem and the people of Jerusalem. Because man, God is concerned about it. God is concerned about the city. God's concerned about the walls. God's concerned about the people that are there. God's concerned about the exile. God's concerned about the people who were in exile. God's concerned about Nehemiah. God's concerned about all of them. And so all of a sudden when he hears that people are in disgrace, he's like, man, I want to be concerned because God's concerned. And so how do I show my concern? Typically, we would say, hey, we want to act. I need to do something about it. I see that God's concerned, and now I need to do something. And so he does something. But what does he do? For days, he mourns and fasts and prays. And after he's done that for days, then he asks. So if he was praying for days and he wasn't asking, what was he doing? What would you pray to God about for days? Why would you not just ask him? Why would you not just ask him a million times? God, please can I do this? Please can I do this? Please can I do this? I got to eat some lunch. Sandwich was good, God. Thank you. Please can I do this? Please can I do this? God, I'm still waiting on an answer. Please can I do this? Please can I do this? Please can I do? Isn't that how we pray? God, this is what I want to do. God, this is what I'm thinking on doing. God, I wanted to let you know. Just wanted to give you a heads up. I know the whole thing. I believe you actually know what I'm going to do. I believe that you actually are aware of these things, but I wanted to be courteous enough to let you know that I'm concerned for what you are concerned for, and therefore I'm going to do this, and I wanted you to be aware of it before I went and go did it. By the way, I need some help with this. Could you send me some funding? And I need some wood for these gates, by the way. Oh, and I need some safe passage. And so I just wanted to give you a heads up that I need those things magically in my pocket before I get outside the gates of my own city. So if you can just hurry that up, that'd be great. I just thank you for listening. Just want to make you aware. Isn't that how we pray? We said, hey, I've already decided what I want to do. I'm concerned about what God is concerned about, and so I'm going to do something. I know what I'm going to do because I got a plan. God, here's my plan. Send me the letters. Appreciate it. But for days, Nehemiah sits there, and instead of bringing his ask to God, you know what Nehemiah's praying? Nehemiah's sitting there saying, hey, here's the deal. I'm concerned about what you are concerned about, but I don't know what to do. And so I'm just here to pray and say, hey, I want to do something. Tell me what to do. Tell me what to do. Like, God, I know I got to do something, but I don't know what. You think Nehemiah, cupbearer to the king, who's never been to Jerusalem and never built a thing, you think it was his idea to say, yeah, send me to build the wall. Send me to build those walls. I'm very qualified. No. That wasn't Nehemiah's idea. Nehemiah didn't go in to get approval with God and say, hey, by the way, this is my thing. Now, Nehemiah sat for days saying, what do you want me to do? The only one who could ever imagine rebuilding the walls of the city, of the people of God, with a guy who eats chicken and tastes wine for a living is God. There's no one else coming up with that plan. Anybody else who does come up with that plan, you're stupid. And there's nobody who wouldn't tell you, like, are you kidding me? Have you seen the people that have built the Persian Empire? We've got people. If you want to rebuild some walls around a tiny little city, which, by the way, Jerusalem, very tiny compared to the kingdom we have built, we've got people we can send. That's the idea you and I come up with. Only God says, yeah, send the guy that eats the chicken. But that's the thing. That's the key. You see, we ought to take action. If you're a follower of Jesus and God's concerned about something, we ought to be taking action. However, most often our action should be preceded by listening. Most often our action should be preceded by listening. Now, I don't want you going crazy on me. Like, there are moments where you can't sit around and listen, right? You can't wait. A kid starts running out in the middle of a street and there's a car coming. You can't say, well, I'm going to sit here and see what God wants me to do. Right? You can't do that. No, you snatch him by the neck and say, what are you doing? You're going to kill me, you know? I'm going to have a heart attack, you know? Now you tell him. But that's not the majority of our lives, is it? The majority of our lives isn't this reactive thing where we've got to save somebody's life. A lot of times we can be concerned about something, and we do have the ability to say, hey, look, I'm going to take some time, because maybe my first thought isn't what God wants, and so I'm just going to sit. I'm going to fast. I'm going to make space to listen. I'm going to pour out my heart and say, God, I'm concerned about what you're concerned about. And then, once you feel like, man, I feel like I'm picking up what God's putting down. All right. So I think I know what you want me to do. You want me to go build these walls. So the thing I need to set that in motion, God, will you give me favor with that guy? In other words, we need to make sure that our desire to listen to God is as strong as our desire to ask God. We need to make sure that our desire to listen to God is as strong as our desire to ask God. Which is difficult, right? I'm like, man, how do we get in this place? How do we listen to God? How do we know that God wants us to leave our cupbearer position and travel miles and miles away to do something I've never done before, in a place I've never seen before? How do I know that that's God and not just something crazy that's happening? There's two things. First is the Spirit of God. If you're a follower of Jesus, the Spirit of God, one of his jobs is conviction, which is to squeeze us a bit and move us towards things. Now, the truth is, though, that our emotions can play tricks on us, and sometimes we feel squeezed about things that God actually isn't squeezed about. But for some reason we do. And so what we need to do is we need to pair that squeezing, that conviction, we need to pair that from being able to recognize the already written and said out loud thoughts of God. Which means that we've got to be involved in understanding, hey, so how does Jesus think? And how do we learn what Jesus thinks? We got to open up the Bible and read what Jesus thinks. He wrote it down for us, or someone else wrote it down on his behalf. And so when we become familiar with the way God approaches the world, and we become familiar with the way that Jesus approaches problems and issues in our world, and all of a sudden we're feeling squeezed, we want to make sure that, okay, this sounds familiar. I recognize this squeezing because I've read the thoughts of Jesus, and now I'm feeling it myself. So now I feel like I've got two green lights. I've got this squeezing inside of me, and I've got this place where it lines up with the actual thoughts of Jesus. So I feel like I got a green light to move. I feel like I got a green light to go because I recognize this. That's just not us, though. We're just not a patient people. We don't like to sit in angst, do we? We don't like to sit in undecided. We don't like to sit with loose ends kind of hanging out there. We want to get it right. We don't want people to be mad at it. We don't want to sit in that. We want to see a problem. All right, well, let's jump on it. I've got Saturday free. That's my only time to fix this problem, right? The rest is Christmas, you know? So we try to squeeze it in. That's just not sometimes how the world works. When I process, how do I move forward in my own life? That's what I've got to work on. I've got to make more space and longer periods of time to hear from God. I don't want to be the guy that just says, by the way, I'm tweeting you what I'm doing, God. Please make sure the blessing gets there before I get in front of them. That would be very helpful. I don't have to manufacture it on my own. I don't want to do that. And I think when we look at our own lives, we don't want to do that. I think we want to spend more days praying so that when we do ask, we're not actually asking, hey, is this good with you? We're saying, hey, I hear what you want me to do. I'm ready. Can you send me? You know? How cool would it be to begin asking God for what he wants? Because we spend enough time listening and talking with him that we've discovered what he wants. You know, if you begin putting these things together, when you realize that the most important day-to-day question about your life is, are you in a position where God can use you? And you realize the answer is always yes, no matter what you've done. If you begin becoming concerned with what God is concerned with, and that concern then leads to action, but your first action is listening and not necessarily following through on the first idea that comes in your mind. When you begin to elevate our desire to listen to God to a place that's as strong as our desire to ask God, I promise you there will be moments in your life where you will be the only one. The only one. Over the last 3 weeks, we have looked at examples of just that. Just one person. One person that changes the course of what's in front of them. And that's us. You might be the only one. But that's never an excuse not to be the one. Be concerned with what God's concerned about. Position yourself to be used by God, regardless of what anyone else tells you disqualifies you. And the hardest thing is going to be make sure we elevate our desire to listen to God to a place as strong as our desire to ask God. I think God's going to give us all opportunities over the next 4 weeks as we move into the Christmas season. Opportunities to be the one. And some of them might be really difficult for us. But in the end, I think the very same thing will happen. People will look at the results and they'll understand God was in it. And that's a great Christmas season.